Good evening. I'd actually like to start my talk this evening with a wish. I wish for all of you a Bas Sona. I said I wish for all of you a Bas Sona. None of you speak Old Irish. Well, if you did speak Old Irish, you might realize that I just wished for all of you a blessed death. Yeah. The trouble is that for many of us, this sounds more like an Irish curse than an Irish blessing. So why is that? Perhaps it's because we live in the most death-denying culture that's ever existed. But every snap of my finger is someone dying somewhere in the world. So my hope tonight is to not only show you that we are unable to deny death, but perhaps we should begin to accept and learn from and even celebrate the time of transition at the end of life. So I've been a hospice physician for over 30 years, and I can tell you that generally speaking, the medical community tends to overlook, diminish, and devalue death in the dying process. Why? Because death represents a failure, something we fail to cure. But the real failure is when we don't see the other side of this coin. And that is that death and dying offer the potential to become a time of healing. Healing not only for the person who's dying, but for their caregivers as well, including we as medical caregivers. But in order for this concept of healing at the end of life to make any sense at all, we need to begin today to realize how we have medicalized death and then use that concept to craft a new version of death and dying where kind of remembering what we have forgotten, in other words, learning from the past and respecting ancient tradition, allows us to see that the potential for healing at the end of life has been there all along. Now, a little over 30 years ago, I was a young fledgling family physician starting my solo practice. Within the first few months, I met a new patient, let's call her Mary, who not only challenged what I thought I knew as a physician, but also started me on a path of learning that continues to this day on this stage. Mary was a 93-year-old woman who was very sick with a failing heart and failing lungs. She had lived a long and a very good life, but she was tired. She was tired of suffering and was ready for death to come. Now, Mary had decided to stop taking her medications, and she came to me asking if I would keep her comfortable. She was determined to do what she wanted to do, whether I agreed to help or not. So to make a very long story very short, I admitted her to the hospital, and I withdrew her life-sustaining medications. During the next 12 days before she died, Mary became my most profound teacher. To begin with, why was I so unprepared to do what she had asked? I quickly realized that my prior experience with death as a physician typically had been in the hospital, either standing at the side of the bed of a dead person whom my CPR had just failed, or watching a patient proceed through a series of medical interventions as their body slowly failed and they slid into an unaccompanied death. Well, unaccompanied with the exception of IV pulls and tubes and beeping sounds. Mary taught me there was a different way to die, where people died with grace and dignity and courage in their own way and on their own terms. I subsequently learned that this kind of death had once been understood and was the standard way to die. 100 years ago in this country, most people died at home. They were surrounded by friends and family. Family knew how to care for a dying loved one at home, and the community around them knew how to support them through the process. Children grew up in homes knowing what death looked and smelled and sounded like. Sir William Osler, the father of modern medicine, lived and cared for his patients during this time. And even though we know him most for teaching us about physical diagnosis, he also taught us how to care for the dying. In his quote, "To cure sometimes, to relieve often, to comfort always," speaks volumes about who he was and who he wanted us as physicians to be. So, what happened? Why is this kind of death no longer standard? Only about 25% of all of us are going to die at home. Well, sometime after World War II, due to the rise of patient autonomy, consumerism, and medical technology, care of the dying was transferred from the home to the hospital. It was thought that we could perfectly manage death with medical technology. In 1995, the support study showed us how wrong we were. This large controlled trial, sponsored by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, allowed us to see the true impact of a medicalized death in the hospital. Dying was prolonged, suffering increased and often ignored, and family grieving became complicated. 25 years later, care of the dying in the hospital has improved, but it still does not meet the actual needs of the dying and their loved ones. During those early morning hospital rounds 30 years ago, Mary taught me that I could not enter her room with my own agenda, that this room, her room, was her space, her sacred space. I quickly learned how to judiciously use morphine and Ativan to quiet her most disabling physical symptoms. It's not the wisdom that I needed. Mary was more in control of what happened in that room than I was. At times, she seemed to be speaking and communicating with deceased loved ones, comforted and not afraid. At times, she seemed closer to death than at other times. And at times, she didn't seem sick at all. I quit trying to figure it all out. I couldn't. I subsequently have realized that this is how someone normally dies, without excessive medication or excessive medical intervention. I also have learned, and again remembered from ancient tradition, that the process of dying is primarily a spiritual process. Now, it has a medical and a physical component, of course, but speaking with deceased loved ones, using symbolic language, and controlling the moment of our death is how humans have died since the beginning of time. At times, Mary was clearly suffering, and my medications weren't working. I didn't know what to do. And although I wanted to, for some reason, I didn't run away. Somehow, I just sat with her. Mary was teaching me, and I, the reluctant and uncomfortable student, was learning. The seed that she planted in me in very harsh and dry soil is that much of the time, suffering cannot be fixed. In the Middle Ages, the ars moriendi, the art of dying, was the primary way of caring for people at the end of life. The ars moriendi drew upon several different faith and wisdom traditions and was clearly influenced by the beautiful insights from the Iberian Peninsula and the Celtic lands. Music, ritual, prayer were all very important, but they also understood several foundational principles. First, that dying is an inherent part of living, and as such needs to be approached with respect and dignity. Secondly, for this dying person, the best way to deal with suffering was to lean into the pain, not around it, but through it, seeking the underlying wisdom and lesson, knowing that doing so afforded them the possibility of transforming their suffering into healing. And lastly, the caregivers did not and could not fix what was happening. Instead, they realized that they had been gifted with a privilege of sitting with, bearing witness to, and honoring this death, this life that was coming to an end. Dr. Michael Carney, who is a giant in the field of palliative medicine, understood, as I do now, how we have forgotten the wisdom of the ars moriendi. In his book, A Place of Healing, he reminds us that most suffering cannot be fixed, and that Western culture does not teach physicians how to help people live through their suffering, which is how healing occurs. So instead of realizing that our fully engaged human presence at the bedside of a dying person is often more than enough, we physicians often ignore that invitation, and we scurry away and grab our morphine pumps and our Versed infusions, hoping to sedate what shouldn't be sedated, trying to mask what can't be masked, and fooling ourselves into believing that we are fixing the suffering with our medications when we're just making things worse. During those 12 days that I spent with Mary in the hospital, I often felt inadequate, unprepared, afraid. Was I doing everything that I should? Did she need a consultant? At times, she asked me questions I couldn't answer, not medical questions, but life questions. Was I doing more harm than good? As I think back on those days, I realized that Mary was offering me the opportunity to become the best version of myself that I could possibly be. And that is to be myself exactly as I am. Not perfect, but trying as hard as I can. Leonard Cohen, the late, great, brilliant songwriter, in his song Anthem, alludes to this power of individual human imperfection when he writes, "Ring the bells that still can ring, but forget your perfect offering." There's a crack in everything and everyone. That's how the light gets in. Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen, who's a physician, sage, and author, reminds physicians it's not our white coat and all the initials after our name that we need in caring for people. It's something more basic. I may be just the right person for the person in front of me, as it's not our expertise that bless people, it's our humanness. So the clear lesson for me from my wise predecessors and validated by all of the patients that I've cared for since the beginning is simply this, that we are the medicine. Our simple human presence at the bedside of the dying, just showing up as the perfectly imperfect beings that we are, not having the answers to all of the mystery of death and dying, is often more powerful than any medication I can prescribe. This is not easy to do, but it's necessary. Oriah Mountain Dreamer, in her piece, The Invitation, speaking on behalf of those who suffer, ask, "Are you willing to stand in the center of the fire with me and not shrink back?" I say, yes, we can, and we should. The day that Mary died, she died alone. Nursing staff reported that she had been comfortable at the time of death and was peaceful for hours ahead of time. But did she die alone? I tend to think that, like so many others before her, Mary's death was guided by, and she was accompanied by, deceased loved ones who had gone through that door of transition from this life to the next. Mary opened a different kind of door for me. It was the door of better understanding of the kind of death that Dr. Osler called us physicians to provide, and a deeper understanding of the mystery of death and dying. And although she only opened that door a small amount, all of the patients since that time have opened that door of understanding wider and wider and wider. About a month after Mary died, her niece, who was her only living relative, brought me a gift. It seems that Mary had been an esteemed seamstress and was known and loved for her quilts. So her niece took one of her favorite quilts and made for me a teddy bear. Now, this teddy bear has blessed my desk every day since. It's a constant reminder of Mary's lessons and the lessons that I've received from all of those people who have gifted me at the end of their life. So, back to, may you have a blessed death. What does that really mean? Well, if I could extrapolate from the intentions of the ancient Celts and augment that with what I have learned from being with people waiting for that veil to part, I have several thoughts. First, as you encounter suffering along your journey, no matter the source or the cause, do not ignore it. Do not stuff it into some corner of your being. Do not self-medicate with drugs or alcohol or other ways to numb the discomfort. Instead, lean into it. Face it head on. Seek the underlying message and wisdom in your suffering. knowing that you also can transform your suffering into healing. And please do this before you are on your deathbed. Secondly, we know that death is the inevitable outcome of this life. Keeping death at arm's length while you're living invites the high probability of being completely overwhelmed and unprepared when death shows up, and of causing overwhelming grief for your family. In the Middle Ages, memento mori, remember death, was a primary way of society reminding themselves each single day of their own mortality. Maybe we should each have our own version of memento mori. And lastly, spiritual pain is the most difficult kind of pain to treat. Our medications don't work. Studies have shown that most spiritual pain involves forgiveness issues. As a matter of fact, Professor Richard Groves, who is an author and historian, refers to forgiveness issues as the common cold of spiritual pain. And so, begin to practice forgiveness now. Forgive yourselves, forgive each other, forgive the universe, and forgive God. If you do all of these things, it increases the likelihood that you will have the kind of blessed death that the late Irish Anamcara John O'Donoghue wished for all of us. And that is that when you lie down to do it, you'll be able to do it with grace, with great serenity, with a lovely courage, and a little excitement about where the new journey is actually about to take you. And so now, as I wish for all of you for the last time, a Bas Sona, I hope you have a better idea of how and why to make this happen. Bas Sona.